Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hi there. Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. It's great to have you here. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're actually up to episode number 34. The Language Fuel podcast is for language teachers, and we share best practice and keep up to date with what's going on in terms of technology, and we meet some really interesting language teachers who've done some fantastic things. So I hope you enjoy being with us this episode. Today on the podcast, we're going to go over a really basic 6-step process on how to teach vocabulary. Now, words are often considered to be the building blocks of language, and sometimes grammar is considered to be the mortar that kind of keeps all the words together. And in fact, linguistically speaking, there's a lot more building blocks that make up what we call language, all the way from the smallest unit of sounds right up to the highest level called discourse. And of course, when we're teaching a language, there's many other things apart from these linguistic building blocks which we need to teach. I'm thinking of, practicing and training fluency, getting that muscle memory going for pronunciation skills, developing good learner habits, and all of those sorts of things. Having said that, building up vocabulary is a really big part of what a learner needs to do when they're learning a new language. And most teachers actually teach new words every single lesson. So it pays to have a really great system or a process for teaching new words in place. Now, the reason why I'm choosing this topic today, even if you've been teaching for a while and you think, I know how to teach vocabulary, this is silly. Well, actually, frequently I've seen teachers make a ton of mistakes in this area. For example, they use a lot of words to explain what a word means. So more words doesn't make one word more easier to understand. So that's a very easy trap to fall into. Another one is the classic question, do you understand? It is the dumbest question ever. Never use that, okay? Never ever say, do you understand? Why not? Well, the way a learner responds to that is according to their culture. In some cultures, learners want their teacher to feel good, so they're going to nod as if they're saying yes, even if they don't understand, which is pointless because then you don't know the truth. And then in other cultures where there's perhaps a higher value placed on being precise in your communication and direct, they might say, no, I don't understand, which puts the teacher in a difficult situation if the teacher is not prepared to convey meaning in another way. So either way, whether they say yes or no, you got to be prepared to actually convey the meaning a different way anyway. So it's a pointless question, just don't use it. So hopefully, even if you feel relatively confident teaching vocabulary, today's podcast will give you a really good 6-step process for how to teach vocabulary whenever you need it. So here it is. The basics are: number 1, show; number 2, elicit; 3, check; 4, model; 5, drill; and 6, note. Let's have a look at what all those things mean. And I will provide a downloadable summary for you in the show notes. You can find the show notes at languagefuel.com/podcast. So look for them there. But let's go through them one by one to explain what I'm talking about. So the first step is show. You need to show students the meaning of a new vocabulary item. Notice it does not say tell. Using more words, like I said before, does not help. We need to show the meaning. So how do you do that? Well, maybe you want to draw a picture, maybe you want to act it out, maybe you want to point to it or pass an item around, maybe you want to draw a timeline if we're talking about present, past, maybe a cline in terms of gradients of meaning from, say, hot, warm, lukewarm, cool, cold, that sort of thing, explaining relationships, drawing relationships with other words. Show students the meaning. Don't tell them, just show them. Second, elicit. So the meaning is clear to the students already. They might already know the words, so you can elicit from them what it is. And if they know the word already, they'll feel good by providing it to you. So, they're co-creating that lesson with you. And it shortcuts the process because if they do know the word already, you don't need to go any further. in a group, in a classroom situation, it's very likely some students are going to know the word, some won't. So you'll be able to tell very quickly when you ask the whole group what the word is, or ask them to tell you. Some of them will, some of them won't. Maybe all of them will tell you, in which case this word is too easy. Maybe only one person's going to say something, in which case most of them really don't know, so you need to carry on through the process. One tip for elicitation, though, I have seen a teacher go on and on and on and try to get students to say the word, and I'm thinking to myself, crikey, mate, they just don't know the word. Move on. Tell them. So there is a bit of a balance. Give students time to think about it and maybe tell you. But if they don't know it, they don't know it. That's totally fine. So that's when you go ahead and provide it for them. Say it for the first time to them. So that's the second step, elicit. The third one is check. Now by this I mean use concept checking, which is not, do you understand? Like I said earlier, that is a dumb question. Never use it. But we want to use some framing around the vocab to check if they actually have understood it. So I want you to think about yes or no questions that frame the word. So, like a word we mentioned before, cool. We're trying to, do they really understand what cool is? Well, of course, cool makes sense in relation to hot and cold, right? So you can talk about specific degrees and you're going to get a no and then a maybe and then a yes. So you might say, is 30 degrees, I'm using the metric degree system here, is 30 degrees cool? Everybody should say no, because that's a very hot. Now, if you're using the Fahrenheit system, I don't know what degrees you do, but you get the picture, right? You're going to be asking them, is fire, for example, is fire cool? Well, everybody should say no straight away. If they don't say no, they haven't understood what cool is. Is ice cool? No, because the ice is actually cold, right? So again, explaining where the boundaries of the word cool is, that sort of thing. Is a river cool? Yeah, probably cool, yes. Again, say you're teaching another adjective, the word sharp. Pick up something which is traditionally sharp, maybe a pencil. Is this pencil sharp? Yes. Is my cushion that I'm sitting on sharp? No. So it should be very clear what is the word and what's not the word. So yeah, you're kind of yes or no framing the question there. More advanced vocabulary, like non-concrete words, it can be quite tricky to come up with concept checking questions. So this is actually probably the biggest thing you'll have to prepare when you're preparing your lessons. Think of concept checking questions that you can use for the vocabulary that's important for that lesson. So do take some time there to come up with some. So again, yes or no questions, or things that are easy to point to, that kind of thing. All right, so that's the third step. It was check. The fourth step is model. You need to model the pronunciation of that word for your students. And this is pretty self-explanatory, but the trap to fall into here is some people try to say a word according to what it looks like, in other words, how it's spelled, rather than how people actually say it. Now, this is a classic problem for English teachers because English spelling is terrible. If you're teaching a language where the spelling system is, much more clear about in terms of how it's pronounced, this is probably not an issue for you. But just example, in English, a lot of the times when it's a non-stressed syllable, the vowel is pronounced like a schwa. It's pronounced weakly. So you need to just say it that way. So for example, photograph, not photograph. It's photograph. So don't try to be really slow and say every syllable carefully, because that's not how people say it. You want to model a really natural pronunciation for the students. And you may even want to model it in a phrase, a common phrase that people use that word, or maybe the sentence that you've seen it if you're working through a text, something like that. All right, so that was number 4, model. Number 5 is drill. Now, this is the student's opportunity to practice that pronunciation. You need to take your time here. Don't go too fast. If it's genuinely the first time they've ever heard that word, or maybe they've heard it before but haven't really had the chance to practice, they'll really welcome this opportunity to take some time, get their muscles in their mouth working, and practice just moving their muscles to say it. So you want to take some time to do this. So Of course, it can be a little bit embarrassing if they don't get it quite right the first few times. So a great idea is to drill it as a whole class first. Get everybody in the class to say it together. And sometimes, you can use your hands to guide the beat or the syllables. If there's 3 syllables, you can, guide that with your hand, with a gesture. So get the whole class saying it. That may take 3 or 4 times until everyone's managed to say it all together. And then nobody's hearing anyone make a mistake, but they'll hear themselves. If they're not sounding like everybody else, they'll tell. So 3 or 4 times as a class. Maybe drill individually or get them to say it to their neighbor 3 times. Say it to your other neighbor 3 times. And then individually with the teacher. Hey, Johnny, can you say that to me? Hey, Mary, can you say that to me? So practicing that. Now, I have to say, sometimes language teachers don't like drilling. They think, it's not a communicative language teaching activity. It's not really task-based, or whatever philosophy of language teaching you belong to. I don't really care. It's actually a really good exercise, and most students don't find it boring because they value that opportunity to practice. And think about it too. If you were a learner, if you walk away from a little mini lesson on a vocabulary item and you've had a chance to say the word out loud 10 times, you're way more likely to remember that word than if you only hear the teacher say it 3 times. So that is a really good part of the memorization that students need when they're learning a language. So don't skimp on your time there. Okay, so that was 5 drill. And the very last one, which is what most teachers go to immediately, is what I'm calling note. In other words, then you make a note of what you've actually just already learned and presented and taught to the students. So after the meaning is clear, after you've elicited it, after you've modeled and drilled it and practiced and so on, then go ahead and write the word down and any important information that goes with it. So normally the types of information that a student needs to know about a word is what word class is it? Is it a noun, a verb, an adjective? What the pronunciation is. Now, hopefully you've already drilled that so they'll know it, but in case they forget, they might want to use some phonetic symbols or any other way that they can remember the pronunciation. They might want an example sentence. They might want a picture to help them remember. So those are the things that you would typically write on the whiteboard, or maybe if you use a PowerPoint to supplement your face-to-face time, you might have a slide presenting that information. I don't have a problem with PowerPoint by itself. However, I do think that good old-fashioned writing on the board is wonderful because students are wanting time to write the information down. So the time that it takes you as the teacher to write it on the board is going to be similar to the time it takes them to write it down. So that's a nice way to just make sure you're allowing them time to note these things. So I'll just summarize the steps again. Number 1 was show the meaning, not tell it. Number 2, elicit, i.e. allow the students to tell you if they do know the word. Number 3 is check. Use a series of concept checking questions to make sure they really got the meaning. 4 is model. You're going to model the pronunciation for students in a natural way. 5 is drill. Give them plenty of time to practice that pronunciation. And 6 is note, where you note all that information down so that they can learn and practice at home. Like I said earlier, I will put a summary of this process in the show notes so you can download that if you have found today's lesson helpful. And as I've done in other podcasts, what I like to do is have a sort of a half-page summary with notes that explains it a little bit in detail, and then on the same page, a wallet-size card that you can cut out so you can just quickly put that in your wallet or stick it to your wall near your computer so you can remember when you're planning your lessons. And also, just as a quick reminder, that's about teaching a word. So you're going to be teaching, but just teaching vocabulary isn't enough. You have to remember that learners actually need to practice what they have been taught in order to really cement that information into their brains, to have that memory. So you're going to have to add in activities practicing vocabulary. You're going to need to add in training so that your learners can be self-directed, because it's not very good to have students totally reliant on you to tell them everything. They need to be independent and continue to learn vocab by themselves. So there's a lot more to do with teaching vocabulary. This is just the real basic process of that kind of first encounter, how to teach vocabulary. And the good news is we're going to cover all of those extra steps as well as this basic process in an upcoming course that we're developing. at the Language Fuel Academy. We have quite a few courses in production at the moment, so it's really, really exciting for me to see this coming together, and the Academy is really taking shape. Do check that out at languagefuelacademy.com. Thank you so much for listening today. If you're not already subscribed, you might want to do that by going directly to your podcast app on your phone and pressing subscribe. So if you have an iPhone, the app that you're going to be using is iTunes. If you have an Android phone, you can use the Stitcher app. I like to use one called Podcast Addict. Any of those apps will help you search, and you just type in Language Fuel Podcast, and when you find it, hit subscribe, and that way you'll get each episode as we release it each week. Thanks again for listening. Do leave a review if you're in the mood to do so, and I will see you next time. Ka kite anō. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.